Hi, today I'm going to show you how to take the Children's Corner lead pattern that has a smocked view and an unsmocked view, and I'm going to show you how to put a smocked insertion instead of smocking the top of the skirt. So to get started, you are going to need a pleated insertion with the correct number of rows for the size you are making, and it's helpful if you have an ironing board, or I'm using a lace shaping board mainly because I don't want to have to move my camera. Otherwise, I probably would just do it at the ironing board. But you need something so that you can pin your insertion down and it'll stay there. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But so get out, the main thing you really need right now is your pleated insertion, your smocking guide or your template for the size that you're making. Of course, you need pins. We're actually going to be using some Scotch tape. So the first thing you need to do with your insertion is you need to cut it to the correct length. Most insertions that you would order from the Children's Corner anyway are 60 inches wide, and you don't need that much width. And so you can measure the front skirt pattern for view A and use that width to make your insertion the same width. That being said, if you plan on picture smocking or stacking, you might want a little more fullness than what this will be. But this is the same width as the fullness of your skirt would be if you were actually just smocking the top of the skirt like in view A. So cut that to whatever length you prefer, and then go ahead and pull out threads on each end of your insertion to give yourself enough room for a seam allowance. And then the next thing you're going to do is place your insertion on some kind of surface that you can pin down, and then the bottom part of the insertion needs to be this measurement, whatever this is, which is the bottom of the template. So I've just laid mine on top of my insertion and then pulled out threads and tied off to that length. But don't tie off all the way up. Just tie off whatever this is on your size. This is the side seam. And so just place that so that it is, the bottom of the template is at the holding row, and then those few rows right there. For mine, I believe it's 6 rows, but again, that'll vary on your size. But I've tied those off so that it's that length. But don't tie off these top rows, which for me, I think is 5 more rows, because we're going to do it a little different up here, because we need to be able to incorporate this these armhole curves here. And I didn't mention it, but today we're going to make this as a ready to smock. And so at that point, you will have a dress that's finished, and then all you have to do is smock it, which is kind of fun sometimes. So we are going to tie this off to this width and then get that done. And when we come back, we will talk about these armhole curves and how you keep those stabilized. Okay, so after you've got those bottom rows tied off and pinned in place, you'll still have some loose threads up here. And so what I've done is I have gone ahead and used several pins to just continue that straight line of that first pleat all the way up here, even though we're not going to tie these off yet. And then another thing I did is I just used some Scotch tape and just taped those threads down so that I wouldn't lose them. And so it just stays a little more snug right there where we need for it to right now. So after you've done that, then you need to get some Scotch tape, and you're going to try to keep those pleats standing up nice and straight. And it usually takes 3 strips. And I'm sorry you can't see this tape, but it's clear. So you just need to feel and make sure that you've got tape that you can draw on, because that's what we're going to do next. So after you've got the tape on there, then again, place your template so that the line that says top holding row is right there at the top holding row. And then make sure that your side, where your side seam is over there at the very edge. After you've done that, then you just trace this armhole on here. Now I'm using an ink pen. Actually, I need a little more tape because I really wanted you to be able to see this. You could use a blue marker, although I kind of found that you can just easily wipe that off of the tape. So a pencil actually works really well, and that's what I would be using if we weren't recording this. So I've got my armhole drawn, did the same thing on this side. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew from the top all the way down over to the side, right on this drawn line. And you're going to use a real short stitch length, about 1.5 for the length. And then after you've stitched once, come back and stitch again. And then when you get that done on both sides, then we'll talk about what to do next. Okay, so I've got my armholes stitched and the tape pulled away. If you feel like there's maybe some little pieces of tape within that stitching line, don't worry about it, because actually that's your cutting line eventually. And so just like any other seam allowance, it'll be trimmed off a little bit. So anything that's left on there will go away anyway. So on one side, I've gone ahead and pulled out the threads right along your armhole line. And also what I did is went ahead, and I'm still using the template, and now I've just flipped it so that I can have it up here to make sure that the top of your insertion is the length that needs to be. So I'm just going through, pulling out these threads so that I can tie them off to the right length. There. So then, since these two are the most important as far as having the correct length, I'm going to go ahead and tie them. And then I'll pull up the rest of these, tie them off, and then we'll be ready to trim away the armholes. So we'll be back in just a second. Okay, so we've stitched the armhole curves and tied off the threads and then trimmed, so just outside that stitching line. Be really careful to not cut any of your pleated threads. Okay, if you've noticed, I've already got one piece of piping at the top of my yoke. And the reason I went ahead and did that is I had to try something new. Usually when I stitch piping on something, especially something straight and something I want to be really accurate with, I will use Wonder Tape and put it on the seam allowance of the piping, and then pull away the other side of the Wonder Tape. It's just a 1/4 inch water-soluble double-sided tape, and so I put that on my seam allowance, and then I can position the piping right where I want it, and it'll stay there. Anyway, I did not realize I didn't have any of that at home, and so I decided to try something different. So what I've done up here, and what I'm going to show you to down here, is this is another kind of tape, but it's called tiger tape, and it's also a 1/4 inch wide, but it's just sticky on one side. So what I've done is I've placed one row of the tiger tape right there below the that holding rows. This is, so you're placing your tape with the edge of the tape on the holding row. Then what I want you to do is get another piece of the tiger tape and put just below the first one with just enough room to get a needle in. We're going to sew in between these two pieces of tape. And as I'm doing this, and as you're doing yours, try to keep your pleats nice and straight coming down so they're not all mushed to one side or the other. And in fact, that's really what this tape does. One of the things it does anyway, is it keeps your pleats standing nice and straight instead of, it's so easy when you're sewing on an insertion, and as you sew, the presser foot just automatically pushes those pleats down. So when you put this tape like this, then they don't have any choice but to stand up. And so you just leave enough room from the two, between the two pieces of tape, and we're just going to stitch on a regular stitch length. And what it's going to do is going to give us two things. It's going to hold those pleats straight up for the piping. Also, it's going to be a guideline for placing the piping, because you will place the piping just below what we're going to stitch right now, which will make your piping on that first smocked row. So I'm going to get this out of the way. So I'm going to stitch right in here, and then we'll be back to talk about the piping again, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so after you've stitched between your two strips of tiger tape, you can take the tape off, and that row of stitching will be just above or below, depending on whether you're doing the top or the bottom of the insertion. But it should give you a guideline, and it should be right there by that, where that first row of smocking will be. So next you'll just place your piping right on top, and you can pin it if you'd like. Because this is now stable here and the pleats aren't going to shift, I feel comfortable just placing it where I want it to be and then just stitching. But before you do that, I do want you to change your bobbin to a color that you will be able to see on the back side of your pleated or smocked insertion. So since I'm using white, I've been using white thread, so I switched to a pink, because that guideline is going to come in handy when it's time to put the yoke onto the top of the insertion and the skirt onto the bottom of the insertion. So I'm going to get the other strip of piping stitched on, and then we'll be ready to move on to attaching the insertion to the skirt and to the yoke. Okay, so I've got my insertion pleated at the top and bottom, and then I went ahead and trimmed the seam allowance. So this is a 1/2 inch here, and then I flipped that seam allowance up and went ahead and trimmed the pleated insertion down a little more because it's so bulky. So now what we're ready to do is put the yoke onto the top. And then the other thing you need to do is to get your front skirt. If you haven't cut out those pieces, get your front skirt ready to stitch on the bottom of the pleated insertion. So for the top of the skirt, for the front, it is it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So stitch your gathering threads so they're about 3/8 from the top edge of the fabric, and then 5/8, and that way you can stitch in between those two gathering threads. So I'm going to get the yoke stitched on, and then we'll be ready to stitch the front of the skirt. So I've got my yoke on and I've trimmed the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Now I'm ready to put the skirt onto the bottom of the pleated insertion. So I've got my skirt gathered. I'm going to pin that on the bottom of the insertion and stitch that in place. And I'll still have that same, another pink line for me to stitch on, so that I'm stitching right where I need to for the piping. So we'll get our skirts done and then I'll be right back. Well, I hope that we have answered some of your questions about putting a pleated or smocked insertion in the Children's Corner Lee. And of course, you know, we did it as a ready to smock today, but you can also use this same tutorial for an insertion that you've already smocked in combination with your Lee instructions and then the video. That should get you through, even if it's an insertion that you've already smocked. But you know, sometimes it's fun to go ahead and put something together and then smock it. Sometimes that can be more rewarding because you've waited till the last to do the smocking, which is the part I think is the fun part. See you next time.